Welcome to the Every Night is Game Night preview series, the show where designers and publishers share their passion and answer critical questions about their Kickstarter projects. If you're on the fence about a pledge, this is the show for you.
Every Night is Game Night Preview Series, Episode 23, Maximum Apocalypse with the Gothic Horror expansion with Mike Gnade. Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome back to the Every Night is Game Night Preview Series. I am your host, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us. And this week, another preview series, another Kickstarter. It just does not end. I feel like 2018 has just been the year of projects, big and small too. So it's not just like the big honking projects. We got a lot of kind of, smaller projects that are a little bit more affordable to you, that are still fun and still, can really appealing. So we are happy to have another one of those kinds of projects. So we are talking about Maximum Apocalypse, a project that launched a little while ago. They are launching an expansion, the Gothic Horrors expansion. We have Mike Gnade from Rock Manor Games. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So Maximum Apocalypse, that is an aggressive sounding name for a game, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it actually, it's sort of the one remnant from the original prototype of the game, or like the original design of the game, which was, I spent a long time developing the game, but in its original conceived form, it was going to be a little bit more of like a mashup type game where you'd shuffle. It was more over the top, and like the title was sort of satirical and funny because it was a maximum apocalypse, because you would shuffle together a bunch of different scenarios and events, so you wouldn't know what was happening.
The most apocalypse possible.
Right, exactly. So you get the most apocalypse possible. But as I worked on the project and as I went from prototype to prototype, the game sort of, it kept the title, but it became, I would say, a little bit more serious and grounded in, as much reality as an apocalypse game can be based on.
So let's take a step back on this show. We like to talk to the designers and get to know you as people. I think that's the kind of a secret sauce of Kickstarter, is that we, have all this access to the designers, and this is what the show is all about. Putting names to faces and stories to all that kind of thing. So tell me a little bit about Mike and Gnade. Tell me a little bit about, your progression as a gamer, as a developer, and then leading into Rock Manor Games.
Okay. I guess we'll start back when I was in 5th or 6th grade, when I got obsessed with Warhammer and Magic the Gathering. One of my friends brought in these Magic cards after summer break in 6th grade, I think, and then soon enough, all of the kids in our grade and in our class were buying Magic cards, and we were playing every recess. So I started on Magic with Revised, played it a ton those first few years, and then when Ice Age came out, I realized I couldn't mow enough lawns to buy enough cards to update my deck to be competitive, so I just gave up. But I've always been a long time video gamer, so I would say my path in becoming a tabletop game designer started in sort of the video game and digital space. I was involved in the indie video game side of things for almost 10 years. Oh. I ran a media site called Indie Game Mag, where we would interview and cover, post about indie games, on the digital side of things, and then did a site, Indie Game Stand, and eventually sold both of those sites. But as a result of running those sites, I attended a lot of conventions, and it was at a PAX East, 2014 or 15, where I had been walking around interviewing a bunch of video game developers, standing up in those booths, holding the controllers, interviewing people, playing the games, and my feet were hurting. So I strolled to the back of the expo hall and saw all these tabletop and exciting card games that I sort of was unfamiliar with, because I had sort of been more focused on the digital side of things and hadn't really bought a board game or card game in quite a few years. probably since Catan or something like that, and sat down and started playing all these tabletop games and really got into a lot of them. And I really liked the deck building games and played like Star Realms, Ascension, a bunch of Ascension expansions, Dominion, and I kept looking for a deck building game that like met all the things I wanted, and that's what led me to eventually create, and design my first tabletop game, which was Brass Empire.
All right. And Brass Empire when did that kickstart?
I think it was the end of 2015.
Okay.
Like it was like November or December. When did Scythe kickstart? Because I was up against Scythe, or okay. I overlapped with Scythe some, I should say.
It's so funny you mentioned that. I had another guy on a preview series maybe about 10 episodes ago, and he was like, when would Gloomhaven launch? That's why we didn't fund the first time.
Well, I mean, I've had really bad luck with that, because Brass Empire definitely, I don't think we launched on the exact same day as Scythe, but we overlapped with Scythe. And then Maximum Apocalypse launched on the exact day that Gloomhaven's second printing launched.
Oh no.
Like Gloomhaven launched, like the second printing launched, like I don't know, like 45 minutes after me or something. And I was like, well, that was a mistake. But I mean, you can never plan on what everyone else is doing. You can only sort of make your own plan. Right. And that's what you got to stick to. So
yeah, there's always going to be something huge. Like now Batman City Chronicles is going to be running.
Yeah. And who knows? There could be something else that's coming out on the same day that this Maximum Apocalypse Gothic Horrors Kickstarter comes out. I don't know. I've done my best to look at like the, there's a lot of groups on Facebook and stuff that put their dates in calendars, but I've noticed that it's the smaller guys that tend to put their dates in calendars, and the bigger guys, they know they can launch whenever they want. They don't need to put their launch in some little calendar for some like small, a few backers here, a few backers there, get a few eyes on it. So,
Okay. So, let's talk about Maximum Apocalypse. So to be clear, it is the expansion that is kickstarting. Maximum Apocalypse did fund and did ship, and people are enjoying it. So we are going to talk about in terms of the Kickstarter project, it is the expansion. But let's talk about the game. For those of us who aren't familiar with the game, Maximum Apocalypse, let's start with an executive summary, from the designer himself.
I guess, so Maximum Apocalypse, I describe it as a roguelike adventure game, fully cooperative. So it was actually inspired by a lot of the indie video games that have come out over the last few years, with like the procedural generation and how every time you play the game from like level 1, it changes and morphs slightly. So, Maximum Apocalypse is similar to that, where you always start from square one. You pick a bunch of tiles and randomly create a map. So the map is sort of randomly generated. So even if you play the same mission over and over again, your experience will vary based on how lucky you are with the way you've set up your map or how you've set up your map. And then the other key differentiator about Maximum Apocalypse, or one of the things I think is really interesting, is that while you do take on the role of a survivor and sort of pick a character class like you would in a traditional role-playing game or Dungeons and Dragons, your character doesn't evolve over the course of different games. It's a set deck of abilities and actions that you sort of, every time you play, you like learn your skill set better. So progressing in Maximum Apocalypse isn't about like grinding out or leveling up your character. It's about becoming more and more skilled at using the deck that you're given, and getting used to the situation and tasks like sort of ahead of you.
So it's like a fixed deck, like Sentinels of the Multiverse.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, that's a lot more like, the roguelikes and video games that are out there where, if you play Spelunky, you start the game with the same set of tools no matter what. But as you play the game and get better and better at it, you learn how to beat each world and each enemy type. And that's sort of one of the design decisions I made at the beginning to sort of focus on.
In terms of tabletop pedigree, like what is this game like? A lot of Kickstarter backers are like, okay, what does this match up with that I already know? I would say, Forbidden Desert and Burgle Brothers. Would that be a reasonable comp?
Sure. So the things I hear the most about are people who don't play the game, who just walk by it at a convention, are like, "Oh, that looks like Dead of Winter."
Hmm.
I don't think it plays like Dead of Winter at all, but
Yeah, not at all.
obviously, there are zombies in my game, and there's zombies in Dead of Winter, and like thematically, they're similar. So I get Dead of Winter a lot, even though I think mechanically it has nothing to. There's very little in common with Dead of Winter. I would say mechanically, each character has their own sort of set deck, so that is very Sentinels of the Multiverse-esque.
Mhm.
And then, I would say I get Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert a lot because it has tile flipping.
Yeah. And the exploration that's kind of based on that, and like that's a timer mechanism, sort of. We'll get into the timer mechanism in a second. I did notice a lot of different like modes in terms of that tile based exploration. So where's the best place to start in terms of? Should we start with the player actions and the player decks? Talk a little bit more about that, or like what you see on the board and how the board interacts. Where do you feel like gamers will get the most knowledge in terms of starting out talking about the game?
Oh, so we're going to get into like the nitty gritty of how to play here, huh?
Yeah, just a bit, man. That's what people want to know. They want to know what they're backing.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess everyone should sort of understand. Like at the start of the game, everyone picks their character, takes a deck. The timer mechanisms you were alluding to is you also take a dice, which represents your hunger. At the end of your turn, your hunger increases every turn. So as the game goes on, the longer the game takes, the harder it becomes, because staying well fed becomes harder and harder as the game goes on. And then I guess the core of the game is in the map itself. You build out a map. So there's all these little square tiles, and you set them out, build sort of whatever design you want. You can make a simple square. You can put some holes in that square so they have to navigate around. You can build branches or dead ends. Then once the map is set up, typically in most missions, you have a van tile, which is sort of what your band of survivors travels in. And you place that van tile on any external space on the outer edges of the map. As your van drives up to the map, it's very loud and noisy, so you all draw monsters and start with monsters in front of you. And then the game becomes sort of more like a miniatures game where cards are attached to you and are attached to your standee, and there are ranges based on which cards you can attack and which cards you can use. And then their effects are based on how many tiles away from you and your allies that you are. So you start exploring a map. You don't know what's out there. Every time you move on to a tile that hasn't been revealed yet, you obviously reveal it. Most of those tiles have a lot of negative effects and traps, which will have you stumbling into more monster draws, or potentially, maybe you stroll into a desert, which makes you extra thirsty and hungry, and your hunger goes up faster. So you'll uncover new tiles, and typically the mission you choose is based on finding a certain tile or accomplishing a certain goal within the map, and collecting enough gas along the way while you're accomplishing that goal to then make your way back to the van and escape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually kind of think, because I was thinking about, I laid this out at my local game night, inviting people to play, I needed to play everything for the review, to talk to you, and like, okay, how do I describe this game? And it came to me this, like, okay, this feels like Forbidden Island plus in a way, because it's like, in Forbidden Island, the tiles are there, but they're always the same tiles, and the only thing that changes is the arrangement of them. In this game, you get a whole stack of tiles. You get a bunch of stuff. You get like gas stations and power plants and farms and and you never use all of them. In fact, I'd probably say you use like a third to a half.
Yeah, I would say I think we have like 40-ish tiles in the base set, and typically you use like 20-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's a little more. It's like half or a little. I mean, some of the harder missions use more tiles.
And then, what that allows you to do is to bake in scenarios. So like what you described was the first scenario, very basic, go in, search tiles, find fuel, go to the van. There's all sorts of other stuff. Like you can find a scientist, and you can, go to the shelter and, kind of defeat monsters that way. So it kind of gives you that variability just in the tiles themselves. And then on the hero end, like you were saying before, it has that Sentinels in the Multiverse kind of deck. So like in Forbidden Island, you have one character card and it has one power that you just use over and over again. This one, you start with a base power, but then you can just do a whole bunch of stuff, depending on how that goes. So like at every turn compared to the, like, the games that we mentioned before, it feels like you added and it feels like you've kind of injected more. I mean, was that kind of, I don't know, like maybe you said that it wasn't quite your intention to do quite that, but I feel like that's how it came out. Am I, I guess, correct in that assessment?
I definitely, I'm not a big Forbidden Island or desert player, so it's not like I went into the game design being like, oh, I really like this core tile exploration mechanic and want to, make that better or add a lot more to it. The game started, Maximum Apocalypse started as just a card game. And it wasn't until, and that card game was okay. Then it got really, really bad. And I basically scrapped everything, and like it got overly complicated, and there was like semi-cooperative, and you could have traders, and it got really complicated, and I burned everything to the ground and basically started from scratch again. And it was at that point that I just had this idea of, people the characters had like guns, and the fireman and gunslinger were the two of the first characters, so they had like an axe and a gun, and I was like, and they basically did the same thing when it was just a card game. They both dealt like 2 damage, punching and shooting a gun, and I wanted to make that feel different when I scrapped it and sort of started sort of from scratch. So I added like, oh, guns can shoot farther than axes, so the axe is going to be stronger up close, but punching is going to be weaker. And I started developing this range concept, which started out as just, if a card is in front of my fellow player, that means it's mid-range. If a card's in front of me, that means it's short range. And then that evolved. That took another step, and a map was formed, and tiles were added. So my intention wasn't to make Forbidden Desert or Island +++. It really came about sort of on the back end of things, and it started off more as just like a card game, like a card combat game. But I will say that, as more of a card game player, one of the things I definitely feel like I was influenced by when you're talking about how every turn you have just all these things you can do is I'm a huge fan of Netrunner, which I just love how it's like, on your turn, you can do like these 4 things, and drawing a card's a thing, getting money's a thing, like playing cards is a thing, like, like everything you do is one of those 4 things, and you can optimize your turn however best you think you can. So obviously in the action economy of Maximum Apocalypse, I feel like that's exactly what it is. It's like every card you play is an action. You can draw additional cards as an action. You can move as an action, like everything. And you can do those things as many times as you want. So if you want to spend a turn running across the map by moving 4 times, you can do that. And in that situation, that might be the thing you need to do to win the game. And there are other times where it's like, you may have spent all your cards in your hand and you just need to draw up some cards to have access to abilities when more monsters come later in the game. And then obviously early in the game, you almost always start with monsters, so you really need to use your cards to equip things, get some defenses, use your cards to attack and kill monsters, so you can actually move out and explore safely. So I wanted to make those I wanted to give people a lot of options without giving them too many things, like where they would feel like they were like over-analysis and like paralyzed by the choices. I felt like each choice sort of fits in a bucket that makes sense, and isn't overly complicated in and of itself, but sort of everything adds to each other and layers on top of each other to make a more interesting and strategic game.
It's definitely has that Sentinels of the Multiverse feel of you play a card and then you play another card, and it doesn't take you too long to read those 2 cards and see, okay, I can make these work together. So like, I think of one of my favorite characters in the base game that I played was the mechanic where the base power was you could retrieve stuff from the discard. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, all right, I can use this. I can be more aggressive with like mines, these disposable items or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Where with a regular character, I'd be like, I want to save that for something, that really needs it. But with the mechanic, I'm like, woohoo! I'm just gonna play this and get it back and
Yep.
get it back. So like that mentality, which is definitely beyond anything that would be in the Forbiddens or something like that. That's definitely here. So that's very cool.
Yeah, the mechanic, and what's interesting about the mechanic is she's actually like built to be more of like a defensive preparation class. So if you're not setting those mines up and retrieving them and then like rebuilding them, like she doesn't have great weapons. Like she's
Right.
not, she doesn't have a lot of offense, or she has to sort of be reactive and use that effectively. So yeah, I mean, obviously I focus on each character playing very differently, and I'm pretty happy with how that turned out.
Mm-hmm. And then the other end of it, what hero would be complete without enemies, right?
Right.
So the way that it works, like, in those previous games, it's always the same thing happening. You're always fighting against the same thing, whatever it is, escape in the desert or whatever. In this game, because it's scenario based, you were able to kind of customize the enemy deck. So like it comes in these chunks. So like you can play against the alien deck. And it's just like this deck of, I think, 20 cards or somewhere thereabouts.
Yeah,
of,
I
like,
think,
of
yeah,
enemies.
I mean, they do range slightly, but most of the standard base game decks are, I think, 25 cards with 2 bosses, 25 enemy, like an assortment of, I mean, obviously there's enemies are repeated, but there's like 25 cards in like the base monster deck,
Yeah.
with different variabilities and likelihoods of certain monsters popping up.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously the aliens, if you've played them, each deck does focus on sort of different mechanics of how they can beat the player. Because in Maximum Apocalypse, there's a lot of ways to die, and each monster deck sort of focuses on a different method of killing players. So the aliens, they actually try to get you to draw cards from your deck and go through your deck faster, because if you ever run out of cards from your character deck, you're dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's some. I think it was I played the scenario with the mutants where it was like these people come in with like doing 6-7 damage to me. I was like, whoa!
Yeah.
So you could die to like get a punch in the face, or you can die by the enemies just kind of like skirmishing and stalling, so that you have to like run around a little bit, or they multiply. Like I think you did a pretty good job of like differentiating the different monsters. So not only is there variability within the scenarios. Like you can, like the scenario has a deck attached to it, but if you wanted to, you could just say, okay, I'm going to play this scenario with the alien deck. And
Oh
see
yeah,
what
absolutely.
happens,
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that some fans, I uploaded like a template for the mission cards so people could make their own missions and scenarios. So I'm hoping that, once the community and people get more familiar with the game, they'll start making and uploading their own missions. Because I'd love to play some new stuff that I didn't come up with myself and try to beat something that I don't sort of know the solution to because I designed it.
Cool. So just to talk about a little bit of the adventures around that first Kickstarter, reading a little bit on the forums and on the comments and all that kind of thing, there were some issues with fulfillment. I mean, is there like particular stories or comments that you heard that you'd like to respond to now?
I mean, the fulfillment is 100% related to, I would say, an unfortunate series of events when it comes to Games Quest.
Mm-hmm.
So all the fulfillment issues have been around sort of the European area, and I mean, number one, the Kickstarter was supposed to fulfill like by the end of like May of this year or something like that. So we were way ahead of schedule to begin with. But people are impatient, and Games Quest not only was busy fulfilling my Kickstarter, which was, I would say, probably like mid-sized or decent sized. We had like 3,000, 4,000 total backers. I don't know how many of those were in the EU, but a good portion of them, probably a little less than half, were in the EU. And at the same time, my games were coming to their warehouse. They were redesigning their whole back-end system and upgrading their warehouse and changing their system, I guess, with how they send stuff out. And that combined with Kumon had 2 little games called Rising Sun and Zombicide Green Horde that apparently were being fulfilled at the exact same time I was. And obviously those Kickstarters were substantially bigger than mine. So I think Games Quest just went through a lot of growing pains all at once. They were upgrading their warehouse, changing over their like computer systems. They had all these, and then they had like 2 huge Kickstarters from a very big company that came through the doors at the same time. And I'm sure there were other little people as well that just backlogged them substantially. So while everyone in the EU has their game, one of the things that Games Quest messed up was they didn't send out the playmats with the game. So the playmats have been the big delay and the thing that have just been like lost forever. And some people have gotten them like a month ago, and then there are people who have like never gotten tracking information for it. So what I think's so funny about it is Games Quest emailed us and said, we're going to hold off on fulfilling the games until the game mats came in. And then the game mats came in and they started fulfilling our games, and then they sent it without the mats.
Nope.
And people are like, well, where are my mats? And Games Quest is like, oh, we're going to send those separately. But I think I just think they were really busy and overwhelmed. I've been on Kickstarter forums on Facebook, and I would say it's a pretty universal story with them in the last few months. In the 2018 up until this point, they've been pretty backlogged and had some severe growing pains. Certainly from what I've seen from other Kickstarter creators, they've been in the same boat as me or worse.
So have there been steps for this particular Kickstarter coming up, a little bit of a smoother experience?
Yeah. So so my plan is to unfortunately not use Games Quest this time. So while this is the first time I've ever used them, and obviously it wasn't a great experience, I would say I'd give them another shot down the road, but I'm not going to risk it on this next Kickstarter, especially since it's an expansion to Maximum Apocalypse, and a lot of the Maximum Apocalypse backers were burned in the EU by Games Quest. I'm going to do everything through Ship Naked this time, who I was really happy with. I used them for my first Kickstarter, and I felt like they're even better. Their customer service and their experience for me as a publisher has been a lot better this time around than it was the first time around, a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago when I did Brass Empire. So, that my plan is to use them sort of for everything, which will give everyone 1 point. It's sort of one failover point. It gives me one person to talk to deal with all the support issues. And unlike Games Quest, I have a more personal relationship with sort of my account manager and stuff at Ship Naked. I can call them on the phone. I can get them on Skype, like I have those connections. So I feel like I can better support my backers by using them. So that's what we're doing this time.
Cool. I think some backers will be pretty happy with that. The second thing I noticed in terms of feedback on the first thing was the rule set. So if you look at it's not a big box. I mean, this is basically a card game, and it has tiles for that variability, but this is basically cards. So and it's, smallish box, and the rule book is, pretty slender. So maybe talk a little bit about some of the feedback you've gotten with the current state of the rules, and if you've kind of revisited them, or if you think they're, what have you done in terms of that end of things?
Well, I would say that the core rule set of the game is not changing. There's really only one rule change that we're putting in or clarifying, I guess, around scavenging. But other than that, the rule set of the game is not changing. But because the rule book was, small and fit in the box, and it was definitely a minimalist rule book where it didn't go in, it didn't go into super detail. It didn't tell players exactly what to do in certain situations. And when you have thousands of people playing your game and you have all these combinations and randomness, there are a lot of very specific situations which can come up, which do sort of introduce, rule clarifications or questions and things like that. So, as part of this Kickstarter, we're adding a bunch of new mechanics with the expansion anyway. So rather than just have another small little rule book that just goes over the new stuff, we're just sort of expanding and adding all the new stuff along with some clarifications to the existing rulebook, and just sort of basically it's just an expanded rulebook, clarifies a few things, has more examples, it's more explicit, describing certain things. We put some new graphics in there that show off more different card types, so you can see more of the card types. I would say the biggest rule expansion that we sort of focused on was showing off more examples of monster cards, since the monsters do all act differently. And going over more of the examples of how they interact with each other and how the monster sets work. So instead of having just like one monster card picture and telling you everything on the monster card, I think we have like two or three, and we walk through how you sort of read that the range and the effects of a monster on a monster card, and how the text and the ranges interact, or how they're meant to interact when you're playing the game. So, there's nothing like crazy. We're not changing anything crazy with rules, but we're just sort of taking the extra steps to make things clearer for new players. I guess new and old players alike.
Yeah, it's funny because I found the rules myself, like they're very slight. So it was almost like an RPG feel where it's like, I don't quite know what this does here, but I'm going to go with what makes sense.
Right, of course. And almost always, if you go with what thematically makes sense, or what makes the game more challenging, that is the design intent, and that's the correct rule interpretation. So that's I wouldn't say the game's like, some people have gotten really overly negative in my opinion, but there's always extremes. There's people who think the rules are terrible, and then there are reviewers and blind playtesters who thought the rulebook was excellent because everything just, if you go with what that makes thematic or common sense, that's what's right, and it makes everything is sort of intuitive. So I've gotten things on both ends of the spectrum. So that's sort of how these things are, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Where the rulebook's probably it's not ridiculously short, and it's not like these severe problems that some of the vocal minority have expressed is probably not true. But at the same time, the people who have tweeted that it's the best rulebook ever, that's also not true. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and there's always room for improvement. So
I like the more examples. I think that'll be really helpful. So we are way far into this podcast, and we finally get to talk about the expansion. So what is Gothic Horrors, and what can we look forward to being added to the base experience?
So the Gothic Horrors expansion is all about introducing supernatural apocalypses and more mystical type of enemies and ideas. So the first set, like I said, is sort of more realistic, or as realistic as a post-apocalyptic game can be. It's more of the general tropes and things you see in most apocalypse genre type material on TV and movies. And this upcoming expansion focuses more on the mystical or arcane. So we have the Cthulhu mythos is being introduced as one of the apocalypses for this campaign in this expansion, along with sort of the classic supernatural monsters. So we call them the vampire set because they're the most iconic of those sort of classic monsters. But in the vampire monster set, there are vampires, ghouls, Frankenstein's monsters, werewolves. You'll be facing those types of things. Then you'll also be facing like cultists, trying to resurrect Cthulhu and other sort of old ones. And then obviously, just like our last Kickstarter, we have other things planned in the form of stretch goals, which we hope will be included in the set as well. That sort of all revolve around this theme of, supernatural or mystical apocalypses.
So is it one of those expansions that's basically kind of more content, so like more tiles, more characters, more monsters, and then like little mechanical tweaks to differentiate the monster decks? Or are you going to introduce more, or is there like a kind of another set of mechanics that are being introduced into the system?
So the game was designed from the ground up to be very modular. So in Gothic Horrors on day one on the Kickstarter, you'll have 2 new apocalypses. you'll have 2 new characters. You'll have the Ronin, which is probably one of the more advanced characters to play that we've had, one of the more complex and advanced characters thus far. And the Priest are the 2 new characters that are being introduced. And then along with all those cards, which the characters are more characters. They do different things. They have different skills. They're designed around different ideas, but those are all types of cards that existing players are used to. Whereas, but we're also introducing a day-night cycle. So after everyone's taken their turn, day turns to night, night turns to day, and different things happen at night and day. And there are new mechanics, and you can obviously add that day or night cycle to any of the previous scenarios. So it's a new deck of cards that introduces new challenges with it that can be applied to any game of Maximum Apocalypse. And then the Cthulhu Mythos Apocalypse, those monsters, obviously not the cultists, but the monsters and grotesque Lovecraftian sort of monsters that the cultists summon. Every time those monsters appear, they affect your character's sanity. So there's a new insanity deck that is added to the Cthulhu scenario. And insanity cards take up your inventory slots. And obviously, if you run out of inventory slots and you draw too many insanity cards, you go insane and you're eliminated from the game. So it's a new way to lose the game. And the insanity cards themselves will place restrictions on you. So for example, you may encounter a monster, which causes you to draw an insanity card. And that insanity card may tell you that you are now agoraphobic, which means that you need to always be heading towards shelter if you're not in one already. Or you may start hallucinating, which will reduce your actions. So you'll have one less action per turn for every hallucination you have. And what are some of the other ones we have? We've got things where if you're ever on a space with other players, you'll take damage because you prefer to be by yourself and you're paranoid. So all these insanities place restrictions on how you can move and what you can do in the game. And they also lead towards you losing your mind and potentially losing the game. So the Cthulhu deck is designed to be a more difficult scenario and monster set as well.
All right. So you mentioned before, I mean, this is a modular game. So, I mean, it's designed to be like kind of the basic structure is kind of light in terms of like ease of play and everything. And then each different monster pack or each different scenario is just going to be able to mix that up. And all we're doing is adding more stuff.
Yeah. I mean, Maximum Apocalypse really is more of a game system than a game itself, in my opinion. That's how it was sort of designed with that in mind. So, like you said, it's once you know the basic system and how the basic system works, most of the rules of the game are contained within the cards and how the cards interact with themselves. That's the most important thing about the game. It's how you're interacting with the tiles on the board, the locations you're exploring, what's happening there, what's happening on the cards that are shown, during the game at any given time. So, I do think while the game is very deep and complex because of all the card interactions and randomness of the game, that the actual core rules in the rule book, that's why the rule book was so minimalistic. I mean, the rules are not complicated. It's, you go through a couple steps, you draw a card, you take your actions, and your turn ends, and the monsters in front of you attack you. And you go around and around. And that's, it's about how you're using those cards and how those monsters are affecting you, which is where the real meat of the game is.
All right. So that is Maximum Apocalypse with the Gothic Horrors expansion. The project is live now as we speak. If you want to go over to Kickstarter and check it out. We have been talking to Mike Gnade of Rock Manor Games. Where can we find you?
rockmanorgames.com, obviously. Is our website and has everything you'd probably ever need to know about us on there.
All right. Thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And that's going to do it for another episode of the Every Night is Game Night preview series. As always, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to Mike for taking some time to share about Maximum Apocalypse. As always, we really hope that you got all the information you need in order to figure out if this project is worth your hard-earned cash. So, if you want to get in touch with us about different Kickstarters, about other things that you want us to shed a little bit of a spotlight on, you can get in touch with me at ENGN_podcast on the Twitter. Check us out. I am just Jason Perez or Pope Sixtus on Facebook and BGG, all the places where gamers hang out. Yes, and please give us a rating, 5 stars or however many stars you think we deserve over on iTunes and Stitcher and all that good stuff. Ratings just really helps us out. It's the thing that you can do to really help us get to the next level in terms of exposure and audience and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to do it. I will see you. Yeah, we're just going to keep on rolling with the preview series. We'll probably have another one next week. So later, everybody.
One, two, three.